So my name is Chris Perez, and I am interviewing Mr. Richard Loutzenheiser. It is November 13, 2016, Sunday at 3:06 p.m. So, Mr. Loutzenheiser, I was just wondering if I could get personal background information about yourself. So, I'd just like to ask you when and where were you born?
I was born March 27, 1962 in Hastings, Nebraska at the old Marion Landing Hospital.
Okay, awesome. So I was just wondering, what was your childhood like?
It's a pretty open-ended question.
Yeah.
Rural, pastoral. I mean, my father owned his own business and traveled quite a bit, and we traveled some. I probably traveled more than most. My grandparents half of them live in California and half of them live in Nebraska. So we would, fairly large, close families, traditional for the 1950s and 60s generations.
Did you need to answer that?
No.
Okay.
My recollections of the Vietnam War stem from the fact that on my paternal family side, we are basically grouped into two groups of cousins. I'm in the younger group, and the older group were all, those grandchildren of my grandparents were virtually all male, and were all far more interested in the Vietnam War experience than those of us that were, born in the late 50s and early 60s, because we were far too young. The war was over before any of us were of 18 years of age. So,
Okay.
But I recalling the major events of the period are not difficult because the Apollo space program was preeminent activity of the time, and so it's easy to recall events in time based on, I remember the various moonshots, I remember various other things that were going on, and I can know what was 1968, what was 1969, what was 1970, even though I was 6, 7, 8 years of age, because those are events that are, there were a number of events that were so significant that even a young mind grasps them, and a number of things that they associate with them at the same time.
Okay. So what was your socioeconomic class would you say your family belonged to?
Upper class.
Upper class, okay. And do you have any recollection of what your family background was like during that time period?
I do, but what do you mean? I mean, be more specific. What are you looking for?
Just like, basically, like what were their experiences like, or what their activities were, or just basic info like that.
I have vivid, extensive memories. How many hours do you want? I mean, I can remember almost everything from when I was 7 years of age beyond. So I need to know what you want to know in terms of my background.
Just like maybe like your parents' background of.
My father was a PhD pulp and paper engineer,
Okay.
who ran his own pulp and paper company and was a World War II combat veteran. My mother was also a college graduate who had worked at the Kaiser shipyards in Fremont, California, and had her own experiences and they were your typical upper middle class, upper class entrepreneurial family. I mean, we were the family you saw on television. I mean, Dad came home from work, Mom had dinner made, the kids went off to their activities, piano lessons and everything you can imagine. So
Okay.
I don't really know how to answer your
Oh,
question.
no,
You could be incredibly more specific, and that would be fine.
Okay. So I'm just gonna start asking you about your lifetime during the war. So what were you doing prior to the war starting, or prior to your awareness of the war?
Well, I wasn't born when it started.
Okay.
The war went on for almost 20 years.
Okay.
So, I mean, what period do you want to talk about?
Probably just like around when you were a child, when, like you said, you were 6 years old during the war.
I first became incredibly aware of the war, probably 1968. I say that because it would be I was 6 years old. It would be the same time as the early Apollo missions to orbit the moon, before Apollo 11 landed on the moon, so Apollo 9 and 10. And my brother was graduating from high school, or should have graduated from high
Okay.
school in '68. He turned 18 and had to go register for the draft. My brother had been held back a year in school, so he was not actually going to graduate until 1969, but he had to go in 1968 and register. He was automatically deferred for the draft because he was still in high school,
Okay.
and it was no big deal at that moment. As I said before, I have 4 male cousins, all approximately my brother's age. They're all actually 1 or 2 years older than my brother, who all had gone off to college. And my first recollections of the war were watching it on television. We had a color TV. We had one color TV.
Okay.
The rest of the TVs were black and white. In the living room, it was the same TV we watched the Apollo NASA programs on. And I was constantly wanting to get updates of the Apollo shots and was very into that. But of course, the nightly news was about the Vietnam War.
Yes.
As you probably read, the Vietnam War is the first war to be televised, and televised within 24 hours of. So, they would show us films on the nightly news that were less than a day old. And in those days, Hastings only really had, in '68, Hastings only had 3 channels: ABC, NBC, and CBS. And ABC didn't come in all that well. Even as you progress into the early 1970s, we only had 4 channels because we had PBS in like '71 or '72. I remember we started having things like Sesame Street available. And then cable television came '72 or '73, and it was HBO and the Kansas City station and one other, which was just Kansas City broadcast TV. It wasn't anything like you think of today as cable or satellite TV. So, you had the primary 3 major networks and their broadcasts, and so I know that my increasing awareness of the war stemmed from it would be, if I was wanting to see updates on NASA, I would see updates on the war, because that's the way the news was broadcast. And my brother was graduating from high school, and even though he had been deferred for a year because he was turned 18 while still in high school, he wanted to enlist in the Navy, and my father did not want that to happen.
Okay.
My father had served in the Navy in combat, so.
So your family, so your dad didn't support your brother going to the war?
He disapproved of it.
Disapproved of it? How did your mother feel about that
She disapproved of it too.
as well?
They, yeah, I'm positive of that, because 12 years later when I joined the Army, my parents did not think it was a good idea either.
Okay. What did you think about your brother being enlisted in the war and not being?
My dad had done, so why wouldn't my brother do it? I was 7.
Okay.
My father had fought it. You have to understand that there was an idealized version of the Second World War going on in the 1960s. There were primetime television shows about the Second World War. It was 20, 21, 22 years after the war had ended. We had won. And you had things like Hogan's Heroes, which were comedy farces about POWs that constantly pulled one over on the Germans, and you had things like Rat Patrol and Combat, which were stylized versions of warfare, nothing as graphic as more recent movies, in which the Americans always won and we were always the good guys. And children of that age, 6, 7, 8 years of age, would play in the backyard with your toy guns, and sometimes you'd play cowboys and Indians. I don't know if sometimes you'd play cowboys and Indians, because westerns were also very popular.
Okay.
Western movies with John Wayne as the hero or other people like that, you'd play that, or you'd play war. And you'd often play World War II war, and you'd be killing the Germans, and winning, because those were the images you saw. Those were the popular movies of the series. But you even sometimes played the Vietnam War. By 1970, I know I had a 70, because I know where I lived. I had a Mattel-made full-size fake fully automatic toy M16 machine gun. You know, it didn't have any of those orange things on the end like they do now. It was the proper size. It looked like an M16. It had a bolt on the side of it. You pulled it and it rattled off, you know, as you fired it. I had a full-size Colt 45, you know, automatic pistol that had plastic bullets that you'd fire and the little bullet would come out and the shell would go out the top like a real 45 would do. You know, I had a plastic soldier helmet. Yeah, it was, so my reaction to my brothers wanting to join the military was, well, Dad, you were in the Navy, why shouldn't Bill be in the Navy?
Okay. All right. So during your time, do you remember any anti-war protests going on in America?
Only the most superficially, well, if we're talking like 69, 70, a little bit on the news. No personal experience of them. I wasn't reading the newspapers at that time, so my only experience would have been Hastings, Lincoln, those kind of things, maybe on a trip to Chicago with my parents. So I remember the family discussions about the students at Berkeley, because my grandmother was a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley, and Berkeley is 2 miles or so from my grandparents' home. So my mom would talk to her mother on the phone, and they would talk about the student protests at Berkeley and about, you know, what was going on and whether or not grandma was safe, and, you know, how were the students, you know, why were these students protesting. And of course my mother and my grandmother were absolutely opposed to the students protesting. They couldn't understand why people would be opposing their government and why they weren't being patriotic and being good. You know, they really had a level of disdain for the student protesters at Berkeley. Beyond that created a sense of me that Berkeley was some sort of radical place. That carried over into the fact that when I was looking to go to college in 1979, 1980, and I wanted to go, one of the places I applied to was University of California, Berkeley, because my grandmother had gone to school there and it was 2 miles from her house, and I thought it'd be fun to go to college near my grandmother. My parents were like, "No, that's a." Okay. You don't understand. That's a radical place. I'm like, it's your grandma. You know?
All right.
So
you didn't have, so all you could remember during the anti-war protest was just, you didn't really have any feelings about it if you were like pro or anti?
I was slightly negative because the adults around me were negative.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
So you've already explained to me that you were a child during the war. Was there, do you have any other experiences during the Vietnam War?
Oh, each year as I get older, I have more specific memories. I remember President Nixon's campaign, escalating bombings, B-52 carpet bombing as they called it, the attacks, and I remember on the news seeing them attacking Cambodia and going and looking up where Cambodia was and hearing about what we called Laos, which is actually correctly pronounced Lao. Okay, and wondering what that was. Seeing some things on TV about American bases in Thailand and the Philippines that supported it. So yeah, each succeeding year, and there's certain images, like I remember the images of the 1975, the final withdrawal. There's some iconic pictures of like the last helicopter taking off the. I remember those.
Okay.
Not just I've seen them in books. I remember them. And I remember the fights my family got into in the early 70s because my cousins Jay and Peter specifically went to graduate school after they finished college so as to not be eligible for service to continue their deferments. And Peter and Jay, not so much Don and Roger, the other two cousins that are that age, but Peter and Jay were fervently anti-war. And so I remember they would argue with my father and my aunt, my dad's sister, about these things from time to time because we had large family gatherings for Easter and Christmas and Thanksgiving, and my dad was the second of 6 children, and there were 20 some odd grandchildren, and they would show up at grandma's house, and Jay and Peter would make it very clear that they were doing whatever they had to avoid military service, and that was not looked upon well by certain other members of the family. So, and I'm 10-ish by now. This is like 72-ish, and I'm very aware of the tension within the family about my cousins legally refusing military service by continuing to go to graduate school and continuing to, find legal loopholes of avoiding it.
Do you remember why they didn't want to go to join the military? Or they just didn't agree with it, or?
Peter, I think, had more of a moral argument than Jay had more of a political one, but because Peter went into Christian ministry and became a minister, and I think, and Jay was a lifetime teacher, but it never, the reasons against it never sunk into my 10, 11-year-old brain, because I still can recall playing games in which we would we'd use a speedboat when it was pulled out of the water and pretend it was an airplane. I'm 9, 10 years of age, and we'd pretend to bomb Hanoi, and intend to bomb Phnom Penh, because that's what we were doing, and we were going to go beat those commies. So, yeah. You also have to remember, well, maybe remember's probably strong. This is Cold War front line, Hastings, Nebraska. I don't know if your class has understood just how integral to the Cold War this part of America was, that I was used to being bombed every day of the week, because the old Naval Ammunition Depot over here that had closed in the middle 60s because it was no longer necessary to make naval ammunition was still government property. And the Air Force built a radar tracking facility there to do practice bomb runs over it. And so B-52 bombers, F-111 bombers would fly over at low altitudes, 500 feet, over Hastings, over the test runs, and practice electronic bombing. They wouldn't actually drop anything, but they would trigger their mechanisms at certain points, and they'd see if they were lined up appropriately. And we would literally get bombed multiple times every day of the week. So it was completely normal for us to see, strategic, the bombers that carry nuclear warheads flying 500 to 1,000 feet off the ground over the top of us. We'd go out in the schoolyard and we'd watch B-52s fly over the top. It happened multiple times every day. Wow. And the Atlas missile silos are that way toward Lincoln. The Minuteman silos are that way toward Kimball. Okay, we'd have lectures in our public schools about what to do in case the nuclear attack sirens go off.
Yes.
And you're thinking, well, this is the middle of nowhere. Well, no, we quickly became aware that this is where our nuclear weapons were based, and so we would expect to be attacked. So I grew up very much a child of the Cold War, a child that the Cold War was going on every day, and as a 7 to 12-year-old, I accepted the notion that the Vietnam was the actual ground front of the Cold War.
Okay. Did you? So you were used to it? You weren't afraid?
Yeah.
Okay.
No. I mean, we look back at them now and we laugh at them.
Okay.
I mean, have you ever seen the movie Duck and Cover?
No.
It's a classic.
Okay.
It's a classic. They still show it at the Kansas Cosmosphere. It's the Space Museum down in Hutchinson. They actually show it as one of the displays there. But they'd show us this thing about how we were supposed to, dive under our desks and close our eyes, and that way we'd be safe from the light of the nuclear blast. But that would be about it, It was a whole. It was a surreal time.
Okay. All right. So do you think, did you have any other family members who were impacted by the Vietnam War? I know that your cousins were impacted.
My female cousins, who I refer to as my sisters, because we actually would spend our entire summers together. They're my age. I said that there's these clusters.
Yes.
I have 3 female cousins who are within 18 months of my age, okay, and 1 male. But the girls and I were like siblings that would spend all summer together. And I remember going with 2 of them, Carol and Sandy, to buy POW MIA bracelets, and not knowing, why are you buying these things, you know? And they were and the girls were anti-war. I'm not entirely sure why, but they were very anti-war.
Okay.
And they were going to wear these things, and they were going to wear them until they came home. And of course, you know, they were like 12, so they didn't wear them until they came home. But they were these little, I think they were aluminum.
Okay.
Okay, and they were, you know, they were strip aluminum that had someone's name and date of capture or date they went missing stamped on it, and then they were bent so they formed like a bangle around their wrist. And they were sold with in various shops all over the country to raise awareness for either men who were known to be POWs or who were MIA in Vietnam.
Okay.
And so you were supposed to wear it until you knew what had happened to that man, until he'd come home or his body had come home or whatever. Of course, as you know, many of them resolved, but many of them never resolved what their status was.
Did you ever consider wearing one?
No.
Okay.
First of all, 1, it was very girly, and I was 12, and I was from the radio. And other ways Vietnam impacted me. A little later, I remember the disrespect for veterans.
Okay.
And that was something that, just the way I was raised, never could countenance that, never could, you know. And to be fair, my cousins, male and female, that were opposed to the war, would not have been the ones to have thrown things at veterans, to have called them baby killers, to spit on them. They would not have, they objected to the war, but they didn't blame the soldiers for the war. And I think that's probably because most of their parents were World War II veterans. Mm-hmm. We came from conservative Nebraska families, you know, and so even disagreeing with the war, there was a different level of respect than we saw in California.
Do you know who they really blamed rather than
You hear this generic politicians, because, you know, President Nixon, you know, won an election on the promise that he was going to end the war, and he did nothing but escalate it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So how would you like describe? Oh,
the other impact of the war
okay.
is starting about 75, 76. Maybe it was 77. Let me think about that.
Okay.
I hadn't graduated high school, so probably about 75, 76. We in Hastings started taking in Vietnam refugees. And my father became incredibly active in resettling Vietnam refugees. I'm not entirely sure why. I never had a long, in-depth conversation of what his motivation was, but we actually took 2 of the Vietnam refugees into our house and put them in our guest room, and they lived with us while they resettled. His company, which had over 200 and some employees, employed at one point around 20 Vietnamese refugees. You know, he helped find housing at the old housing for the old Navy base, which is now Good Samaritan. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you know this, but Good Samaritan Village, the retirement home, was originally the housing for the old Navy base. And the Good Samaritan Society bought that and started turning it into an old age home. But for a while there, they had empty houses. And my father was part of the group that arranged for a whole block of those to become refugee houses. And I remember going to the refugee houses with my dad, 75, 76, somewhere there. I'd be 13, 14 years old. And like I said, Tin and Ton, Tin No and Ton Gwen, both lived with us. Okay. And of course, you know, one was educated, spoke French well, spoke English reasonably well, but spoke French better because he'd been educated and had been an officer in the Vietnamese army. And the other one was illiterate in any language and was not very well educated at all, and had been, you know, just a common worker. And of course, it took my parents a while to figure out, they had issues because they didn't see themselves as being from the same class and didn't think they should be treated the same way, and we just saw them as Vietnamese refugees.
Okay.
and my father didn't realize that, hey, you're here. And of course he realized that the one spoke English better than the other and actually spoke French quite well. And that's when we started to figure out that, he's actually been educated, and he actually, but they had a real class distinction. But yeah, so that the aftermath of the Vietnam War happened because, my mother was Tin's guardian for a number of years. That she co-owned his bank accounts and would help him with his checkbooks and everything. And when he was living on his own, and my parents would go over and check on him. Ton, the more educated one, he went through the assimilation period in his early period, and then he decided to move to Georgia and opened some sort of business there. And he would write my dad letters every once in a while. And after one of my father died, I found a few of these letters every couple of years. So, but
Do you know how long they stayed with you in your home?
I think they were actually in our house for between 6 to 9 months.
Were you guys very close with them, or did they just...
Well, like I said, the one barely was learning English while he was here. He was very nice to me. He was a big guy, very strong young man, and he just wanted to be helpful, and that's the one my mother stayed in contact with for many years. The other one was very small, not as physically fit, obviously more cerebral. He was much more detached from a 14-year-old boy. He wasn't rude to me, but he just.
Okay.
So that's the other thing. But
all right. So in what ways, if any, did the war change your activities or habits?
That I'm aware.
That you were.
That I was aware. I don't know that it did.
Okay.
Wow. I don't ever remember thinking, the stupid war, not like other things have. No, I can't think of any way that the Vietnamese War, that I was conscious that it was changing what we were doing.
Okay. So do you remember, if any, how the soldiers were treated, even though you weren't participating in the war? Do you like in the news maybe, or did they get proper care?
I remember learning sometime in the early 70s as the first that our men who were prisoners in Vietnam were not treated well. That was generally well known, and I remember the flights. of airmen who had been in Hanoi coming back to the Philippines and coming off the airplanes, and on crutches and on stretchers and barely being able to stand. I've seen the pictures of Admiral Stockdale and Lieutenant Commander McCain and certain other famous people, and I have always had this sense that I think I saw them. I think I remember seeing them at the time and not knowing who these people who were or who they would become. Because Stockdale was actually somebody, and McCain was only the son of somebody, but became somebody. But looking at those pictures again later, it's like, I've seen this before. Maybe I didn't actually see John McCain standing there with his crutches, but I remember seeing sailors standing with crutches.
Right. Okay. And then if you could tell me about a specific experience from the Vietnam War era that you can't forget, or your most vivid memory.
Well, from the era, I can't forget Apollo 11.
Okay.
Apollo, being allowed to stay up late at night and watch the moon landing, and watch Armstrong and Aldrin get out and climb and go on the ground. You're in this building. You walk right past Clay's picture and everything. Clay and I went to school together, so we are of a generation that he got to be an astronaut, but we were that same generation where it was just we were adolescents while this was going on. It was just the most fascinating thing of all time, and it just, like I said, it consumed my imagination. I had all sorts of I had Major Matt Mason toys, which were little, I had G.I. Joes too, by the way. I forgot to tell you, I had G.I. Joes, sold the G.I. Joes, and you'd play war with G.I. Joe. But then I had space toys. I had Major Matt Mason, which were like G.I. Joes, but they were all astronauts, and they had helmets and space gear, and they had lunar crawlers and stuff. And so I vividly remember that, which is why I remember some of the Vietnam stuff. What else do I vividly remember from the Vietnam era?
Or just like a most vivid memory of that time period that you just can't.
Well, that
seem
is
to
the most
forget.
vivid memory.
Okay.
I mean, I can see, I can see Armstrong, stepping off. Yeah, because the next most vivid memory is watching Challenger blow up in '79.
Okay.
No, 83.
What blew?
Challenger, Space Shuttle Challenger.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Right.
it blew up in '83. But images of the war. I remember a bunch of images of the war. I mean, the image of the naked young woman running down the street, I've seen 1,000 times. The image of the guy being executed on the streets of Saigon, I've seen that many times. I remember watching the helicopters take off from the embassy on the newsreels. I have these recollections of watching news reporters standing on aircraft carrier decks, and so you get these generic pictures of whichever aircraft carrier was taking off, airplanes in the background. I've seen so many of those I can't distinguish them, because that's a lot of the newscasts would be like that. The reporters would be on the aircraft carrier, and they'd be filming it, and then they'd send the film out. But I don't have, as a historian, I know about the '68 protests at the Democratic National Convention. I don't remember them.
Okay.
I don't remember them. No. I remember sort of meeting. I remember my mother taking me to the Gateway Mall in Lincoln to hear Governor Nixon speak because he was running for president. And we were standing in the, and I'm like, Mom, why are we standing here? Why are we waiting? Oh, this guy's going to come, he's going to talk to us. I don't care. But no, beyond that.
Okay. All right, just transitioning to the post-war experiences. Do you think it was right for America to be at war? Why or why not?
Post-war experiences. It's a very sophisticated and complicated answer because I've studied Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
But we tended to think of it as a proxy war to stop Soviet aggression, and it really wasn't. It really was a war, an internal conflict of the Vietnamese people, some of whom had a more laissez-faire Western orientation, but they were massively corrupt, and some of whom had a more socialist, centralized authority. They were very brutal, which is not an unheard of narrative, and we picked one side, and the Russians then picked the other as we then played each other off, and they managed to get us to spend a lot more resources than they did, and a lot more, anything you can think of, political capital, human capital, money, on the war. So actually it was probably a bad idea.
Okay. So how did you feel when the war ended?
Relief.
Relieved?
Just, just.
Do you have any ideas of what we could have done differently?
Well, the United States Army didn't lose a single battle in the Vietnam War, and yet they lost the war.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they lost some skirmishes, they lost some small group encounters, but there was no major confrontation between U.S. troops and Vietnamese troops that the United States did not win, yet they lost the war. Because the war was really a guerrilla struggle, because we were essentially occupying a territory where at least a significant portion of the people didn't want us there. And, they talk about it being the hearts and minds campaign. We didn't understand Vietnamese at all. And we didn't really try to.
Mm-hmm.
So, what could we have done differently? I mean, some people argue that if we had invaded the North and destroyed the political structure of the North, that eventually the guerrilla warfare would have lost its supply chains. And there's some credence for that argument. And later on, one of the takeaways in the military was, we never want to get into another conflict where we have a self-imposed, limit where we create a safe zone where the enemy can operate, but we refuse to operate. That's that's one of the things we learned from the war, is that when we said we wouldn't invade Cambodia, they invaded Cambodia. And then we wouldn't bomb Cambodia at first because they were neutral, but then they were under the control of the Vietnamese army. And that was just silly from a tactical perspective that we were allowing the enemy to have safe areas where we wouldn't go. The same was true in the north. We shouldn't have been there. I mean, it's one thing. What could we have done differently? Followed Eisenhower's plan rather than allowing Kennedy and Johnson to dramatically commit additional troops. That's what I'd say.
Do you think you could elaborate on what was Eisenhower's plan?
Eisenhower was giving the French colonial government small amounts of weaponry and training assistance, but basically saying it was an internal matter. The Vietnamese government has, at that moment, Vietnam is a French colony. The Vietnamese government has asked for assistance, and we're selling them weapons cheaply, and we send in some people to help train their units, so that they could deal with their people. But President Kennedy then kept sending more and more advisors, until the point that the advisors actually were fighting the war for the Vietnamese, and then it became an American war against the Vietnamese rebels. And then, of course, Ho Chi Minh declared a separate North Vietnamese state. Vietnam became two countries, effectively, and we found ourselves fighting a war against the North Vietnamese on behalf of the South Vietnamese. We staged a coup to get rid of the South Vietnamese government that we were supposedly supporting, because we knew they were corrupt, and so we installed different people in the government of the South, because the ones had been supporting we found to be corrupt and counterproductive, and it got to be completely absurd. It started as something we do all over the world. We sell arms and we send people. We help train militaries. And it became the United States was fighting Vietnamese socialists. And it was funny, is at one point Ho Chi Minh would have happily taken American aid rather than Russian or Soviet aid. Mm-hmm. But we had these ideological blinders on from the Cold War that since he believed in socialism as opposed to a free market capitalism, he couldn't possibly be someone we'd support.
Okay. So do you believe that America should not have just...
We shouldn't have done anything. I mean, if we could go back all the way to the late 50s, we should have done nothing.
Nothing, okay.
Yeah. What would have happened?
Yeah.
The Vietnamese, let's be honest, Vietnam was not a rich country at that time. Mm-hmm. Vietnam would have had a slightly socialist, dictatorial government that if we weren't there, the Russians wouldn't have cared either. So in the geopolitical sense of things, it would have been nothing. But we couldn't let one more domino fall, because that was the language of the time. We couldn't let one more domino fall to communism, because like a row of dominoes, it is. Mm-hmm. And so it took on an importance way beyond what it actually had. 60,000 Americans died. No one knows how many Vietnamese died. They have estimates, no millions.
Oh. And then once the war was over, did your life return to normal, or were some things permanently changed?
One of my cousins did not speak to his aunt and uncle for quite a long time.
Right.
No. The only other thing was. The only other impact I can say of the Vietnam War is America lost its confidence for a while. There became a sense that America, even though we had the world's largest military, didn't want to lose one single troop in a hostile conflict. That we had no stomach for even which meant that we could be bullied because we wouldn't take any risk at all. And I do remember that sense that America wouldn't risk anything, because the American people didn't want another Vietnam. You always hear, we don't want this to be another Vietnam. It's actually Vietnam, but Americans pronounce it Vietnam.
Okay. All right. And then...
At least Americans in my generation do.
Called it Vietnam?
Yeah, Vietnam.
Vietnam.
And just like they call it Laos rather than Lao.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because the word's French.
French.
So the S is silent.
And have you ever thought about joining the military later on?
I was, yes. I joined the Army.
Oh, you joined the Army.
Mhm.
Do you think you could tell me some experiences about joining the Army or?
My father didn't want me to join ROTC. He thought I didn't need to. He could afford to pay for college. He didn't stop me. He just told me that he didn't think I needed to, and he hoped that I would be safe. I was trained by some Vietnam vets in training command. It was a period of time in the early '80s when the military was looked down upon still, even that somehow it was the legacy of Vietnam. So no, it didn't deter me one way or the other.
Were your other family impacted by you joining the war? Did they agree, disagree?
Well, I didn't join the war. I was 1980.
So. Oh, 1980.
Yeah.
Or the military? Army?
No. I'm sure Peter thought I was crazy. But my cousin Ty, who's 2 years younger than me, was a naval aviator for 20 years. He joined the Navy about 2 years or so after I joined the Army. He stayed in for 20 years. Family's proud as could possibly be of him. Even the cousins who were anti-Vietnam War. No. No, my family, except Jay, had a little trouble with Aunt Carolyn for a while because they were both hard-headed, both opinionated people.
Who is Jay?
One of my cousins.
Oh, your cousins. Okay.
My cousin Jay, the oldest of my cousins. He was very opinionated, as was my Aunt Carolyn and his Aunt Carolyn as well. They didn't speak. They had a strained relationship for a while because of war protesting. It didn't have any impact on our family. Otherwise, no.
So, how did the rest of your life essentially go after the Vietnam War ended?
It didn't affect me at all.
Okay.
I remember these things. I suppose it affects my thinking.
Okay.
But Vietnam was not growing up on the home front with family, or it didn't.
Okay. So thoughts on the war today. If you could explain the war in one word, what would it be?
Mistake.
Mistake?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think you could elaborate on why you chose mistake?
Well, we fought it for the wrong reasons. We misunderstood the geopolitical situation, escalated our troops for the wrong reasons, and weren't committed to doing whatever it took to win once we had done that. And so it became a completely impossible situation. You create safe havens with places you won't go to allow your opponent to constantly regroup and then come and reattack you. We became more and more authoritarian in Vietnam to try and control the territory because the enemy was good at hiding in plain sight because almost no American soldiers spoke Vietnamese and no concept of the culture, so they all look alike. They all dress alike. They all sound alike. How can you tell a good one from a bad one?
Yes.
And that leads to some horrible consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So
what conclusions would you just draw about the war?
like I gave them, we shouldn't have been. I mean, it changed military doctrine afterwards. We always, if you look at the Gulf Wars and those things, the military had very specific things they were looking for, which were learned in Vietnam about how not to fight a war.
But is there any lessons did you learn that you want others to remember about that time in history?
I don't know what they are.
Okay. have your views changed about the war over time, and in what ways? Because I know you were.
Oh, my views have absolutely changed
Yeah.
over time. At the time, I didn't question it at all. I thought I was young and I was patriotic, and let's just win this war and come home like we won World War II. Over time, I came to have a much more sophisticated view of it as fought for the wrong reasons, fought with the wrong tactics, fought with the everything, and came to view it as a mistake. It's not to say that if I had been my brother was 4F and was not eligible for military service at the end. That's what ended that argument, because he wasn't allowed to enlist by the military, by the Navy, because my brother had lymph node cancer that he didn't even know he had until he had his physical. So in some ways, the Vietnam War saved my brother's life, because if he hadn't gone for that examination, his cancer would have spread even further before anyone noticed it, and so it may not have been operable. Because my brother's still alive today. After he had surgery when he was 19 to remove his lymph nodes and his cancerous lymph nodes, and this huge thing that had grown all over his neck and head that he didn't even know he had. So on some levels, the Vietnam War saved my brother's life. But he was not allowed to enlist, and he was very upset about that. My father was very relieved.
What made your brother so passionate about joining the war?
Same as me. It's what we did.
It's what you did.
It's what you did. America's fighting a war. I'm a young man. I go and do it. I had the same feeling about the Gulf War. The 1991 Gulf War. Had I stayed in the Army, I would have either been a first lieutenant or a captain in the Nebraska National Guard Infantry, and I would have been deployed to Iraq, because that's what they did. And I remember feeling, I suppose shame is the word, that I wasn't in the Army still and that I wasn't going. Because that's what we did.
So during that time, it was more of a kind of trend that men should be joining the war?
It was definitely in my family and in central rural Nebraska, it was an expectation. My father was a PhD pulp and paper engineer running paper mills in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in 1942. He had a war deferment that was permanent. Because trust me, you can't run a war without paper. Okay? And somebody had to run the paper mills, and he was a PhD pulp and paper engineer who ran the paper mill. And he gave up his deferment to join the Navy and go and fight, because that's what you did. Okay? And so that's what you do. So on some levels, my cousins that were actively draft evading, they weren't dodging, they weren't doing anything illegal, but they were actively evading. I understood where my aunts and uncles came from, but I also later understood where my dad came from. My father fought at Okinawa. Okay? He didn't want anybody that he cared about to ever have to go through that. Okay? He didn't want anybody to ever have to have I didn't know until my father had died and his best friend was talking to me about what they used to talk about, because they were both World War II vets. My father had tremendous survivor's guilt. Why had he survived the war when so many of his friends had died? He actually had a high school classmate die on the USS Arizona on the first day of World War II, on December 7th. One of the men who died in the Arizona was from Gothenburg, Nebraska, and got high school with my dad in the same class. He'd known him his whole life. So my father suffered. The reason my father didn't want us to go was not that he didn't understand our sense of duty. It's that he had experienced it and wanted to spare us that trauma and that guilt.
And you guys, your brother and you just didn't agree with...
We didn't understand it.
Didn't understand it, okay.
I did not understand that his motivation was to spare me the pain that he had gone through his whole life for military service.
So if you understood him before you joined the military during that time, would you still have joined the military?
I might not have.
Okay.
I might not have. And I might have anyway. I might have said, well, Dad, you also joined and you got unlucky to fight in Okinawa. Maybe I'll be lucky and serve in peacetime, which I did.
Okay. So you were a Nebraska conservative during the Vietnam War era. Did that change as the war ended?
No.
It stayed the same?
No,
Okay.
I'm still a conservative Republican.
Okay.
Not a Trumpian, but I'm a conservative Republican.
Okay. So I'd like to give you an opportunity to share anything that wasn't mentioned. Is there anything else you'd like to show or anything I forgot to mention that you would like to add?
I don't think so. I mean, no.
Okay. Right. Well, I'd like to thank you so much for taking your time to do this interview with me, and I'm very appreciative.
No problem.
Thank you again.